goals. We're actively working on redesigning our website, doing some branding updates, and making our website more easily accessible and user-friendly. And one of the parts of that is to create an area on our website for new to the field stormwater professionals and students. And so this presentation, the context for resiliency, is meant to both be a retreat, sort of get in the mood for what we're going to be talking about all weekend, and understanding the context for the history of our region and our MS4s, but also something that can live on past the retreat and live on our website as this sort of introductory workshop session topic that we can then refer people to in the future if they're interested in hearing a little bit more about the history of the MS4s. So the session will be recorded. We're going to start the first part of the session with a presentation with a stage setter from our wonderful group of panelists, and then we will pivot into a moderated Q&A. I have some questions queued up, and then we'll also turn it over to the audience. So feel free to be jotting down notes, any questions that come up, because you will definitely have the chance to ask those questions. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Carol Wong, and she is going to start off our presentations.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming early and joining us for this session. So I'm going to start off with permits and programs with Jason. We'll be talking next. And then next, Dave and Shirley will talk a little bit more about different practices. So, whoop. All right, I'm going to stand so I can read it. Those in the room might already know a lot of this, but since it's recorded for the newer audience, I'm just going to talk about it a little bit. So a lot of what we do is based off of the Clean Water Act. And this one sentence says so much. It's unlawful to discharge any pollutants from point source into navigable waters unless permit obtained, right? So what is a point source? Point source is anything that really comes out of a pipe. EPA defines these point sources. Everything else is not a point source. That's just kind of the definition. So one example would be ag runoff. Typically not a point source. And so if you think about it, it comes out of a point. That's why it's called a point source. So things like a glue factory or a paint manufacturer, urban stormwater, or like a combined sewer, a wastewater treatment plant. All of those have a pipe. If you picture kind of the facility and the plant, it has a pipe that comes out, and there's something coming out of it that might be polluted. And whatever's coming out of it needs to meet a certain permit, needs to meet a certain pollutant load or concentration that is safe, and then it can be released. And so non-pollutant source is just everything else. So navigable waters is also an important one, and that's highly debated. Y'all can Google it. There's a lot of court cases right now about it. So as of right now, it's jurisdiction of the waters of the U.S. And the waters of the U.S. is the thing that's being sued, and what does it mean, or wetlands included, and how disconnected does it need to be so that they're not connected. And so this is just something that's kind of moving off, the target's moving a little bit for us. So just know that that's why the waters of the U.S. matters, because that's where the Clean Water Act applies. So if it's not waters of the U.S., the Clean Water Act does not apply. So how do we regulate these point sources? I'm saying that out of the point, you have to reduce that nutrient or pollution by a certain amount. It's regulated through the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NPDES, or NIPDES. There's a bunch of different names depending on where you are, what it's called, but that's the program that regulates these point sources. So shifting gears just a little bit, we have TMDLs. So this is also under the Clean Water Act under a different number. That's total maximum daily load. What that is a pollution diet for your water body, whatever that water body may be. And it's developed by the state or EPA for impaired water bodies. There's a 3-3 list that each state compiles of impaired water bodies. And it might get to a point where it meets a TMDL, a pollution diet. So it's how little pollutant can enter that waterway and that still meet the designated use of that stream or water body. So I'm not going to go into too much detail because I can talk forever about this, but one thing that's important is that TMDLs are not regulatory controls. So having a TMDL itself does not mean that that stream has to meet that whatever the number is in the TMDL. It just means that it's been reviewed and looked at and says it's polluted, If you reduce, let's just say nutrients, if you reduce your nutrient source by that much, it can be a healthier stream or healthy stream. And so there's a lot of math involved, but in summary, it's a point source plus non-point source and some margin of safety, right? So like we talked about earlier, point sources are things coming out of pipes, and non-point sources are things that kind of overland flow, right? There's no pipe involved in it. And so we're going to focus on these point sources because that is where the MS4 permit lives. So municipal separate storm sewer system. It's regulated by an NPDS and it's usually updated every 5 years, roughly. And what this permit is saying is in those 5 years, here are the metrics that here are the things you're gonna do within your jurisdiction to improve what's coming out of the pipe. It's not that just the permit itself does not mean you're meeting your TMDL. It's like short-term goals to get towards your TMDL. You might never meet your TMDL. Like trash TMDLs are typically zero, like 0% trash is how healthy stream. And let's think about the reality of that situation. Is there really going to ever be a stream that's at least somewhat urban that doesn't have trash in it, right? So TMDLs are like these high Cadillac goals, and the MS4 permits are just steps to reach and get towards that goal. For the MS4, it's based off of your urban area. So really rural areas don't have an MS4 permit, or they typically don't, I should say. And it's based on your population. So with MS4s, there's large, medium, and small MS4s. So large and mediums are considered phase 1. And the phase, very confusing. It's just when it came out. So phase 1s came out first, and the next phase of permits came out later. So all these smaller municipalities are phase 2s, and the larger ones are phase 1s. This is a slightly outdated map. It's from the 2009, I think, but the green is phase 1 and the blue is phase 2. This is just to show you that it's basically regulating urban areas, right? It's a high population, high density area that is regulated under the MS4 permit mostly. There's a few caveats to that, but it's, what does it say? I think it says it's 4% of the land area, but represents 80% of the population. So there's a lot of people in these areas. And the other thing to note is this is roughly, the numbers always fluctuate because it's based on the census and it's based on the permit cycle of the state. If they're adding any new MS4s, there's about 855 phase 1s and under 7,000 phase 2s. About 1,000 of them are in Pennsylvania, which is crazy. That's a lot of municipalities to manage. And maybe Shirley can talk a little bit more about Pennsylvania things, but it's not because Pennsylvania is super urban. It's just their government structure makes it awkward to apply this national program to Pennsylvania because of their tiny municipalities. But get off that soapbox. Okay, that's all about the MS4s and TMDL.
Thanks, Carol. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to talk a little about a couple things from Arlington's perspective that over my time there that have been notable. This way? Good. Okay. Sorry about that. This 5 things I'll talk about in a minute, but this was part of a presentation I gave at our Council of Governments. They have an annual forum with EPA and the states. We were just talking about, my role was just to talk about MS4 permits and kind of where we're headed. And I'm going to toggle forward and then come back with the first one there about requiring a lot more effort. So this was fun to put together, pulling our old permits about how many pages were in the permit over each permit cycle. So you can see how they got longer. That's not always better, but I'm just emphasizing here that they had more in them. We learned some things that added programs, so they've gotten much more complex and I think a lot more required over the time frame that we've had ours, the first one being in 1997. But going back, so we've got more effort. We'll be talking more about this, but we got a lot more on our to-do list than water quality with local governments, particularly with flooding and climate change and other pressures, aging infrastructure, et cetera. So we really were trying to emphasize, keeping that focus on clear water quality outcomes when you're writing a permit. That's been something we've been paying a lot of attention to. Sometimes there's a lot of administrative requirements, paperwork, reporting, doesn't necessarily tie to that water quality outcome. So we've been, as much as we can, and we influence and negotiate permits to really emphasize focusing on the outcomes. And then this number 4 is an interesting one because the reverse isn't necessarily true. So if you anything that's good for local water quality is going to be good for the bay. But when I say not necessarily the other way around, I'm thinking about things like nutrient trading, where you could have an entity be able to not do what it needs to do locally, but as long as it's somewhere within a certain watershed that helps the bay, that benefits the bay, but local water quality can be compromised. So that's what do the people say, a feature, it's a feature and a bug maybe of the Bay TMDL in some respects, that's part of it, and it has its benefits in place, but I think sometimes it maybe has gone too far. And this last one is this question, and this was, we're in a different time now, and I won't editorialize too much up here, but there was a trajectory where these permits were getting more requirements in them to deal with things that weren't really about water quality. And I think there's a healthy debate about how far permits should go, whether it's talking about things like equity or flooding or resiliency. Should that be an MS4 permit or not? And I think, again, that's open for a healthy debate. So just as switching gears, talking about flooding, I'm going to highlight a couple of things that's been really happening in Arlington. I know others in this room have experienced it as well, and that's just this issue of more frequent and intense flooding. We had the situation, I think a lot of urban areas do, where old streams were built on. They were put in pipes and built buildings, roads and houses built over them. This is one of our watersheds where this occurred. And we have these nice aerial photos to kind of trace back where that old stream bed was. And so, when there's really heavy rain, these systems overflow and there's really nowhere for the water to go other than through people's homes and properties. And we've seen a lot of this. This was a big storm in 2019. People have, 5, 6, 8 feet of water running through their yards and their basements. And this is something we've really started to have to respond to because it's a life safety issue for sure, but it's not an easy fix. At all, given kind of the legacy land use and drainage situations that we're all dealing with. So, we've kind of looked at this particular strategy of, even if we can enlarge a pipe as one thing we could do, we can't get to it. And so we started this down this road, and it was a new effort for us in Arlington. We really hadn't thought about it before, a voluntary property acquisition. Acquiring not eminent domain or anything like that, but just offering the homes in the highest risk areas an opportunity to sell their home to us. And part of it is we want to break the cycle of unsuspecting buyers buying homes that then are subject to flooding. And in Virginia, there's no disclosure requirements for a home that's not in the floodplain. So your home could flood and you don't necessarily have to reveal that in the sale. So we started down this path, and it's complicated. But one of the things that when you look to the future, these are just some images, you could see, like in that previous slide, the goal would be you would acquire that overland relief pathway, and then it would be returned into a natural state. It would be designed to convey flooding when it happens, but otherwise be a green feature for the community to enjoy. So that's the vision. It's going to take a lot of time and money to get there, but we're starting down that path now because one of the things we ask ourselves is, what will people sitting in our chairs, say 20 or so years from now wish we had done? And we're pretty sure this is one of those things. So we're starting to work on that, while we also continue to look at, meet our MS4 permanent water quality obligations. So I think that's my piece for the panel. I'm going to turn it over to Shirley.
Thank you, Jason. I guess we'll just stand on the other side. So now we're going to shift toward practices and information. I'm going to apologize. I have to put on glasses. When you add enough zeros to your age, so they have to wear more glasses and things like that. Oh, sorry, I need to see attention. I put a couple of slides in here from a presentation I gave to a PhD Defense International, where they have to come in and they want you to put the PhD in context. So it's very interesting to come back in and start trying to dig out and see how far back could we get stormwater information published. And this is one you can begin to see. This was in, let's see, I'm trying to remember where it was, but basically, they looked at the runoff from family homes, apartment buildings, and you can see they were looking at turbidity, color, pH, BOD, nutrients. We're getting data back that far, and they had a literature review that went internationally. So again, the good part is with looking at history, we can see how far we've come. Hopefully we're doing better than some of those numbers. But again, it does give us some perspective on what we're doing. And that was 64. Obviously, many of you in the room know Bob Pitt's work, the National Stormwater Database. So again, we're allowed in the history to think about what are we seeing, what are our improvements, and what are the practices that we can put in that drive it that direction. And again, as we think about it, driving forward, what I'm really thinking about is we've been putting in practices, and this is what you all do so well here as your work, is talk about how do we begin to address things upstream. The practice should be our last defense. That's what we really should have. We have to think about the land use. And I go back to a project that I was working on years ago. And I remember coming in and I remember Lee McDonald's in the room somewhere, I think still. Yep, there he is. I emailed him. He was on our board of advisors. I emailed Lee and I'm like, Lee, I've got some weird nutrient data in the stream. We're doing a stream restoration monitoring on. And what was happening was this was supposed to be our reference stream. We had a diurnal cycle of nitrogen. My alumni, his employee, went and looked it up. There was a package plant on that stream that was discharging once a day, 400 gallons at 16 milligrams per liter. And there is nothing you're going to do with stream bank restoration with the nitrogen sitting in the stream. It's just not contacting the vegetation in a shallow, wide stream. So again, this is where we have to be thinking about driving the practices, not just at the end, at the ponds, or even coming up of the buildings in the bioretention. What can we do about source control as we start trying to drive forward? So I think that goes over to Dave at this point.
Thanks, Shirley. Good afternoon. Wow, look at this group, stormwater. Yeah. We all love stormwater. Some of us have been loving it longer than others. Like that guy and that guy. What is it with that row there? So yeah, a little retrospective on the eras of stormwater, and it kind of feeds off of the things that the permits obviously drive the types of practices that get installed. So a little bit of retrospective, just kind of spitballing it in these eras. If we have the hubris to think that these recent times have invented the field of stormwater management, then we're sadly mistaken, because in ancient times they had to manage the water. They just didn't, either they didn't have enough or they had to be very efficient in the use of it. So how many people have seen the Wright Paleohydrologic Institute website? Yeah, you have. So yeah, just the study of how ancient civilizations managed water, which is quite interesting. I really like the one on the left, the yellow circle. This is, I believe it's Machu Picchu, but the stone building here had a thatched roof, and you can see a little rivulet carved into the rock. So that caught the water off the roof and directed into a cistern. So in that period of time. So the first era of stormwater management is ancient. The second is not so ancient and very unfortunate, which we call the nada times. In other words, what should we do about erosion control and stormwater? Nada. So that's the way it was, right? Shirley, you remember the nada times?
Times.
Yes.
Yep.
Talking about that with David. But then we started not ignoring it, and we started doing basins largely. So this era was, would you like that wet or dry? Maybe with a side of regional. Those were the options that back then. That's what we knew how to do. It was pretty much an engineering solution. And you know, there's a lot of these that still dot the landscape, but I have to say, we really haven't graduated from this era quite yet, because they still seem to be the go-to practices in a lot of places, which kind of started in the 1980s. When I first started, regional was a big deal, because about every 10 years somebody says, this is the answer, we finally figured it out, and it was going to be regional basins. But then they needed permits, they dammed streams, they didn't end up being the answer. So the next era was also going to be the answer, which was LID do or LID don't. And LID means low impact development. And for those of you who are more recent to the field of stormwater management, you'll notice that, again, about every 10 years, we have to change the language. There's some regulation out there that says No, that's not the right word for it anymore. Used to be low impact development. Then we had green infrastructure, better site design, and now we have nature-based solutions. All natural. All right, so, and this is the era which is kind of my favorite because of the TMDL and the regulatory drivers and MS4 permits. And all of a sudden, we had staff people at the local level and local governments whose job it was to do this stuff. And that was a sea change because all of a sudden, it wasn't just, say, EPA or a state government pushing it down, but it was generating a lot of practice ideas, a lot of lessons learned about these things from the local level, which to me was a phenomenal change in the field. And because of that, it wasn't only just new careers at the local level, but we needed contractors that knew how to build it. We needed people to maintain them, or at least we finally learned that we needed that. So really, maybe a lot of people in this room, your career is due to the evolution of these practices and the regulations. So then we have the resilience era, and basically it was there all along, and we knew it. We always knew it. We sort of had to go on other side roads that were reducing nutrients and phosphorus and water quality, and somehow entertain the notion that practice-wise and regulatory-wise, that water quality work could be cleaved from the quantity. We don't believe that anymore. I mean, it's hard to open your eyes and read anything to suggest that that would still be the case moving forward. So those are the eras that I have identified. And now, for the real show, we got Michelle. You want that?
Thank you to our wonderful panel. Come on up and take a seat. All right. We are going to pivot into the Q&A section of this presentation. For those of you who are a little bit late into the room, this next part of the session is going to be, first I'll start us off with a couple of questions, and then we will turn it over to the audience for questions and participation as well. So if you're here and you're new to the field, if this is your first stormwater retreat, if you're really here to learn about what the heck you just signed up for, ask away. I'm going to introduce, or this panel is going to introduce themselves a little bit more deeply in just a moment. So if there are things that they share about their experience that you're curious into digging into, please ask those questions. And for those of you in the room who have more experience, who have been in the field for longer, when we turn it over to audience participation, feel free to share both questions, but also your input and your perspective as well. And then as we get going too, when the audience is asking questions, if I have the mic, I'll repeat the questions, but if the mic's over here, we'll just make sure to repeat the questions both for the room and for the recording as well. So to start off, because I think we only sort of grazed the top of your illustrious careers, could you introduce yourselves once more? Tell us about where you're from and what your background is in the stormwater world.
Thank you, Michelle, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Jason Papacosma. I work for Arlington County, the geographically smallest county in the nation. That is a fun fact. And I had the privilege of, I work in our Department of Environmental Services, and my group has both stormwater as well as climate and energy. And operationally, they don't have a lot in common, but of course, big picture, they have very much in common with all things climate. And I've been doing this work for about 25 years, background in environmental science. And if you want to pass it around for the intros, yep, I'll pass it over to Dave.
Dave Hirschman Water Environment currently. My background is local government. I have a colleague, Greg, over here, who works for Albemarle County, where I used to work and learned so much at local government, and also worked at Center for Watershed Protection, where Carol works, and private sector, biohabitats, and now my own company. So just been circling around everywhere I could go. So I got to find the next place.
Carol, along with the Center for Watershed Protection. I am a water resources engineer. And yeah, I've been at the center for 11 years now. And basically where my career in this world started. Yeah, and about 15 years of experience. I volunteered, the Chesapeake Conservation Corps member, if anyone else wants. And so, yeah, then I went back to grad school. So I'm a mechanical engineer and then, environmental engineering master's. And then, yeah, got my job here, so love it.
Thanks. I'm Shirley Clark. I'm professor of environmental engineering at Penn State Harrisburg. I have the weird background. I have, my bachelor's is in chemical engineering. So all the unit processes part around water quality. Drives me nuts when we simplify to percent removals. But I can talk about that over drinks. You know, again, a lot of my work has been around trying to better understand and model what's going on inside these practices from a biochemical standpoint, because we've got high variability in the results we're getting. And if we can begin to narrow it down, we'll never get rid of it. We can begin to narrow it down through design. That's where we are. I've been at Penn State for this start my 23rd year. I plan to stay for a couple of them and move to New England. That's not worked out real well. I am immediate past president of the Environment and Water Resources Institute of ASCE. So I've been very heavily involved recently around issues around climate, resilient design, and ASCE's efforts around what we're going to do around federal data sets that are starting to disappear. And how we're going to do that, what do we need to be doing resilient design? And how do we think about it? I'm just going to, last statement was a couple of thoughts I had after I sent my slides in, was that we have some data to understand how these practices may operate in high flows, in high intensity flows, through the International BMP database, and I have the slides somewhere if somebody wants to see them. But that we are going to have to be thinking about from a resiliency standpoint, which practices are optimal as we are going to be driving into a world where the rainfall energy in the mid-Atlantic is greatly increasing. And so our practices are not designed for some of that until you start getting to what Dave showed and Rob Traber affectionately refers to as HIGS, holes in ground. So our ponds, which can take a lot of that fluctuating flow, but a lot of the other practices can't. So I'll stop there.
And
Absolutely.
one thing I forgot to mention in my slides that I was like, oh crap, is that I mentioned that TMDLs are not regulatory controls, but why does the Chesapeake Bay TMDL matter so much? So it's because of the Bay Agreement. So the 6 states and DC signed this agreement saying that they will meet their TMDL, and that's why our TMDL has so much more drive behind it than other TMDLs in the nation. And so that's a really important thing to note as to why we are able to kind of do things like the very progressive things that we're doing in the Chesapeake Bay.
Well, I should answer your question. The question that Carol raised was, what's wrong with Pennsylvania? It's the way we develop. What we really have is a lot of small boroughs that just barely meet the population limits for an MS4. And the state's expanded some of them out to do some additional ones that sit. We might have a borough of 8 to 10,000, 12,000 people sitting in the middle of acres and miles of farmland. And that's just how we've developed. And we have a very strong borough control structure and a very weak county structure.
Thank you.
1,500 boroughs. Wow.
Another opportunity to expand a little bit on what you each talked about in the presentations. And this is for anyone to start. Can you talk a little bit about what the MS4 permits looked like when you first entered into your career and how you've seen them change either in language and regulation over the course of your career?
Well, we talked about the number of pages in the permit, so that's changed. No, I think Carol teed it up well too, because these are point source permits, but mainly because I think some clever attorneys figured out that that's how you regulate stormwater, but everything else about stormwater really isn't that. It's really a non-point source that is regulated as a point source. And the early permits, the interesting thing is that they didn't have, we've been training people here for years, right, to become stormwater experts. There really weren't a whole lot of experts in stormwater at the time. So the people writing the permits and overseeing them were traditional point source folks. And so they reflected that. It just didn't really, connect that well to on the ground implementation, but that's changed dramatically and in a good way. I mean, I think there's a lot more understanding, at least from my perspective. I mean, Ginny and I can talk. When Ginny was it still DCR then?
What?
Yeah. like, there was a lot of collaboration and conversation around what does our permit look like to reflect the Bay TMDL, and that was big. It was a big deal. It was brand new, but it was a conversation as opposed to like a command and control, which I think really made a big difference in actually having them be workable. So that's one change I'll highlight. I don't want to hog the mic because I could talk. It's like Captain America. I could talk about this all day.
My career in water management started before MS4 by a good number of years. So it came along and, you know, the word was there's this federal regulation, we have to get this permit. It kind of didn't make sense. I worked at local government then. But it came along and we had to do this permit application. And it was just a 6 minimal measures, no numerical targets for pollution reduction or anything. So I turned in that first permit, and as Jason said, the guy at Virginia DEQ, he was a point source guy. He didn't know what this was all about. So you know, one of the 6 minimal measures is public outreach. So I put in my first permit. We're going to distribute 1,000 brochures to the citizens about non-point source pollution. So the guy said, no, you probably should reduce that to 200 because you don't want to overpromise. So I said, okay. Cross out 1,000, put 200. And I said, what are you going to do with this permit application? He pointed to a cardboard box in the corner of his office. And that's what they did with the permits. Come a long way since then.
My career has not been as long, but I will say that one of the things I've noticed is, especially in Pennsylvania, is collaborations. Working together to kind of have a similar goal, because like we talked about in Pennsylvania, there's just so many MS4 and it's not efficient to run little tiny MS4 programs. So even just the 6 minimum control measures, it's a lot. And to share that information and like one organization do it and then share it amongst multiple municipalities, I think it's a much more efficient way of running it. And the MS4 permit is just not designed for the tiny boroughs that Pennsylvania has. So that's a really big thing, I think, in Pennsylvania that they're doing. Their new draft MS4 permit includes collaborations and collaboratives and giving them, let's just say points, credit or wherever the word you want to use, for collaborations. And I think that's a really smart thing to do, rather than having, I can't even imagine 1,000 something MS4 permits that DEP would have to review. It's a lot. So that's kind of what I've been seeing.
So I'm probably the wrong person to be answering this question on the panel, so I'm not in the regulatory environment. I was in the research environment at the time the permits came out. They started trying to define that. It's like, well, now we know where the research questions are. And EPA started putting some money behind trying to better understand performance. You know, and then we're starting to talk about how could we expand out sand filters to other locations, because there were cities like Austin and others that already were doing things to try to address stormwater pollution, particularly the big things that were visible, the solids, the erosion, and the oils and greases. Just, you know, again, because it just looks bad in your stream, and people were complaining. And so I just remember the research kind of focus changed, some of the money changed, and that's where it went. And so part of my career spent with actually working on industrial permits, stormwater permits for some of the regulated industries.
Just to add one little bit about how it's changed. When that first permit came out in Virginia, I think I was one of 3 local government employees that were tasked with water quality and stormwater type stuff. And so mostly it was just handled by Public Works Department or Engineering Department at a local government. And we were talking about that earlier. The change now is it's ubiquitous. And the extent to which that is huge for local capacity to implement, even to envision and design and figure out where the best place to put these practices is and maintain them. It does take local capacity, and to see how the MS4 permitting has been directly involved in building that capacity is one of the real sea changes in the field, I think.
And to build upon capacity and collaboration, have you seen the types of organizations, the types of people in the rooms where these conversations are happening? Have those folks changed? Who do you think are really vital collaborators in these processes, and how has that changed? Whoever would like to start.
So a lot of my research has been with local entities. What I've really found with that, and I think just listening to all of our backgrounds in the panel, and people I know that are in the room and your backgrounds, it's quite a variety. Because again, it originally started off as trying to apply point source people who were used to gray infrastructure to dealing suddenly now with the stormwater and water quality. And that idea that we were going to treat something out in the natural environment without electricity to do backwashing or, you know, have an activated sludge system, and all that, it was, or no chemicals, was actually really foreign, except for going in and putting in the detention or retention ponds to also do, weight control. And so what I've really seen now is the embracing in the stormwater field of the ecologists, of the biologists, of the horticulturists, botanists, of the, all of the people that are in there, other than the person who's like, here's Manning's equation to design the pipe.
Yeah, and that's a great one. One of the other ones I see is behavior change and communication flips. I think that, public perception of stormwater, a very small number of people that know what it is, know what we do, but I think that that's a really important key point of it, right? Like the rain tax in Maryland and that being repealed and educating people and we were just, there was a behavior change, class here earlier and we were chatting a little bit about it and people understanding what we're doing rather than just having a bunch of equations at them. I think that part is really key to our success because, you know, that's in terms of voting and where our money goes and, you know, with budgets being cut, we don't want them to cut this, but people don't know what we're doing, then why would they keep it, right? And so I think that's a really important piece that we are seeing a lot more of those folks being involved in these conversations.
Yeah, just to add, I think a big positive thing has been the role of NGOs working in partnership with MS4s and local and state governments. So oftentimes they're the ones that are really trusted and involved with the local community. And they are going out and getting grants and bring in the local governments as a collaborator and a partner to implement the grant. So they have it's a whole kind of industry unto itself is the NGO. It used to be they were more adversarial towards government agencies, but there's a lot more partnership now. And along with that, the funders, obviously, thanks Alexander and Sadie. And that has come a long, long way from the early days in terms of availability of grants.
I'll take it from a little different angle, just because we're so small, we don't really have, we do have a local NGO, but it's not the same dynamic as the larger watershed areas. But one thing that I found, I think, to be pretty rewarding in the evolution of sort of the stewardship mindset is with our operations folks. You know, so a lot of our permit is spent on training and education to folks who do, you know, road repairs and water and sewer repairs. And, you know, we have some really good people who, you know, the whole meeting people where they are mindset. So instead of saying like, we're going to have a training and you're going to come and listen, like now the team goes and meets each crew, you know, or crew type specifically and does training, like kind of where they are and then kind of in their space. And they really appreciate that, but that also then can internalize that. And so we've seen that really improve. And, you know, there were lots of years that went by where we would get a call about some illicit discharge and it was us. It was some county crew doing something and didn't really know what the rules were. And that's always a little bit tough, but that has, that's changed dramatically. So that's kind of a different angle to your question, but just an area I think it's really important. Yeah.
Sorry, I have to have the last word. I think this is something Shirley said, but something I just thought of is what the citizens see about stormwater is the vegetation. And we came a long way to realize that that was on equal importance as the engineering parts of stormwater. So that's come a long way, but it's really something we're still wrestling with and trying to figure out.
So I'm going to ask one more question. I have a whole list of questions, but I'd like to ask one more and then turn it over to the audience for a while. So in your presentation, Jason, you mentioned what folks in 50 years might look back on and wish that we had done a little bit differently. So from that frame of mind, what do you think we've been spending a little too much time focusing on versus what do you wish we were focusing more on?
Sorry.
Okay, Jason.
I sat on this side, I can start. Well, it's been touched on a few times. And this isn't like an all or nothing statement, but I think nutrients and the focus on nutrients has been challenging when it comes to, explaining like what the real problems are and getting people to really buy into it. So I think that's just, and it's still front and center in how we regulate stormwater and what the standards are. And I think we can do better. It's kind of to Dave's point, like we have this sort of like, there's quality and there's quantity, but there really isn't, right? It's just kind of a continuous all runoff. So, I don't have the answer to it, but I think knowing, with the resiliency being there all along point you made, Dave, that I think that's, you kind of have to reorganize around that and figure out what that looks like in terms of water quality and TMDLs and permits. But more questions, I guess, than answers, but an observation.
So this is 50 years, what?
50 years in the future.
Yeah, I don't know, but it might be like 5 years or tomorrow, I don't know, but there's an aspect of stormwater management is the elements of turnable knobs. Because engineers like to fix things, so we want, what's the sizing of the practices and the sizes of the pipes and the soil media composition and all that stuff. Maybe we can get a little more phosphorus reduction or nitrogen reduction, we'll turn these knobs. And it's a great, I enjoy the exercise of turnable knobs. But one of the things that we realize is our predicament now is more about land use and not so much. Land use has to complement the turnable knobs. We're not going to fix this, and they're going to realize that. And we're already realizing it, that without really comprehensive land use and the way that our communities are on floodplains and in the communities and in the drainage networks, it's really a land use thing. And without that, the knobs can turn, but we're just kind of tweaking things.
I have yet to think of a good answer. Because Jason said the one that popped in my head about us focusing more on water, not equally, but both on water quality and water quantity. We're very water quality focused right now, and we're kind of transitioning to the quantity side, but, and I get why, and this is not, the MS4 permit is about an impaired water body. It's not about an impaired water body flooding. It's about a pollutant in that water body. And that's where a lot of our funding and a lot of our money is coming from. So like, how do we add in flooding to it when that is the focus of the Clean Water Act? And that's what we are, supposed to be working towards. That's what the MS4 permit is for. So, and so it's a silo in the government system, right? Flooding goes to FEMA and NOAA, and that's another world, and EPA doesn't really play that game. And I'm not saying that it shouldn't, and it's an evolution. Like Shirley works with the ASCE and NOAA and about the flooding and climate resiliency and kind of trying to bring that together, but it takes a lot of work because that's not how the conversations go right now. And I think that we need to work on bridging those gaps because there's like hydrology people and like the flooding people, and then there's the stormwater people, right? Like they're not always the same, and we're not always having conversations together. So I think that would be a really good point to start. And then we are starting to have those conversations, but I think trying to figure out how to fund the other side from our perspective would be really great.
Okay, now that you all took my answers.
You come up with another one.
Oh, yeah, I will. I'm gonna build actually on yours, Dave. It's land use, but it's also what goes on in the land use. If I'm thinking about what your children and grandchildren are going to be saying, I'm not convinced that my family's gonna have any of those, so but that, neither of my nephew or niece are moving in that direction, but anyway, so that the idea of it's not just, is it housing or is it commercial? They're gonna look around at all the asphalt and wonder what in the heck we were thinking. Couldn't we have gotten by with a little bit less? But they're also going to be looking at our choices for how we built things. They're going to be looking at what we chose to do on the land, how we chose to compact the soil. We look at how we chose to pick materials for roofing, and that are going to leach out pollutants. They're going to wonder why, and they're going to wonder this about the government. Why didn't we require, as materials came on the market, that we didn't focus on what were their negative impacts? I mean, we don't require roofing material to run through leach testing. We just don't do it until we get it out there. It's like, oh gee, did anybody realize that galvanized roofs, the sacrificial ion is zinc? And so what do you do when it hits acid rain, zinc washes off? It's doing exactly what it was designed to do, but that's not good for the fish. So, that's gonna be one of the questions they're gonna ask is why didn't we have a process as materials were approved to have things looked at? And same with the other one, I had one that came through my head quickly. Turning the knobs after the problem is gonna be always a challenge, because that's really what we're doing, is we're turning the knobs. And we are not going back and looking at the land part of it. And I don't remember the other one was, so I'll try to, pardon the senior moment. But that is going to be a large part. Oh, I know what it was, is going back to what Jason said. We've got a lot of focus on nutrients. If I walk into anybody and mention that maybe we should be concerned about residual metals in the sediment, like from legacy dams and things like that, they're like, well, that's not on the permit. And here's the second side of it, because what it means, what's on the permit is what we measure. We don't measure anything else. So what we know is that, for example, nutrients complex with metals, and we get these metal nutrient complexes that do not get treated. So we're keeping the nutrients in the environment, but they're not being picked up easily on the cheap test we run in the lab. And we're carrying the metals through. And then, of course, with the heavier flows, we're starting to scour a lot more. And that's gonna be the next question that I was going to put up there, is that going back to the issue of ponds, we've been doing ponds for years, but that actually may end up being our saving grace in some cases, because all of the dry practices we've got are going to scour in climate. So again, and there goes everything we capture just gets washed right back out. So we're going to have to keep hoping as it slowly goes down the piping system, and we've got something at the end that catches it, because what's going to catch it next is going to be the sediment in the streams. And we're relying on the sediment to provide, and the phytoplankton and all that to provide a life cycle in the streams that we may not have. We may go back to having challenges. So I'll leave it at that. Happy note.
Hey, Michelle.
Yes.
I'm not on the panel, but I actually have 15 years of retrospective.
Are you ready for the microphone?
Yeah.
I was gonna add too, we're going to make sure we end on some where we move forward commentary, but if it gets a little dark, it's bound to get a little dark.
I'm Scott Kraft and I'm from Richmond, Virginia. And I got involved with stormwater in 1975 as an undergrad at Virginia Tech. The summer between my 4th and 5th year of landscape architecture program. My faculty advisor got a grant through our community design assistance program with the city of Waynesboro in Virginia. And they had the same problem that Jason showed a slide about. The original problem, which was they had a stream road ran through the middle of the city. And every now and then it would flood out of the banks and a whole bunch of homes would get flooded. And they had hired the Corps of Engineers to do a study to see what should be done to correct that. And after spending $150,000 with the Corps of Engineers back in 1974, a lot more money today, the Corps said, if you're willing to spend $3 million, we'll pave the channel and widen it and you'll have all the capacity you need. Typical old civil engineering solution. They didn't have the money. So they asked the community design program if they get some students and faculty to come in, look at the problem. And we did. And the solution turned out to be buy the 10 houses that get flooded every 3-5 years and turn that whole area into a park, knock the houses down and make it a park, and you won't have a flooding problem anymore. And so that grew into a grant that my faculty advisor got, back to somewhere between 4th and 5th year, to write a manual for how to design the land to manage the water so that it didn't become a problem. And I got hired part-time that summer to be an editor on the book and a contributor to the book, but I did more editing than contributing. And 2 years later, we finally finished all the cycles we had to go through with the university to get it published. And my faculty advisor was gracious enough to allow me to have co-authorship with him because I did contribute a fair amount. The book was titled, it was just a paper-bound book about this thick. Typical university document. It was titled Site and Community Guidelines, Design Guidelines for Stormwater Management. It's the first time I'd ever heard that term. We kept talking about drainage, and so forth and so on. But 1975 was before stormwater management was a thing. And in February of my last year in landscape architecture, we had done some interaction with the old Soil and Water Conservation Commission, which became DCR, Jason. And the chief engineer called my faculty advisor up and said, do you guys have anybody graduating that's actually got some experience writing technical stuff? And he said, as a matter of fact, I do. And so he gave him my name, and I ended up getting hired by the predecessor of DCR to come in. And at that time, I'll interject an extra era, Dave. After World War II, the Department of Agriculture came out with a law, PL 566, and federal statute that was basically aimed at flood control, localized flooding control. And the program was aimed at providing federal grants to landowners to build big detention ponds, retention ponds, capture the water and slowly release it so that it didn't cause flooding anymore. And in the early 1970s, there was a big lake in Fairfax County called Lake Barcroft. And the lake kept getting filled up with sediment because people were building subdivisions all around it and they didn't control the soil. And so the soil ran off into the lake and filled it up. Now it's no longer doing the work of controlling flooding because there's no capacity. And so that ended up resulting in the General Assembly in Virginia passing an erosion and sediment control law. And when I got hired, the law was passed in 1975 and a handbook had been written. And when I got hired, I was helping to implement the erosion and sediment control law, which had some requirements for detaining water so that it didn't erode the receiving stream channel. That was really the first stormwater management that was done in Virginia and then subsequently in other states up and down the East Coast. So my first two jobs with the Soil and Water Commission were, number one, I collaborated with some folks at the State Water Control Board and we wrote the first urban stormwater management manual that actually had practices in it. And this is to help implement the Clean Water Act. And the second job was to write an agricultural best management practices handbook to do the same thing on a non-point source type thing, Carol. The interesting thing was when I was in landscape architecture school, we had Ian McCard, renowned landscape architect, come down from the University of Pennsylvania when I was in third year to give us a lecture. And his lecture, and this is where the throwback 50 years, what could we have done different? The lecture was about a job he had in Texas. I think it was outside Dallas, but it was a new community, residential community, mixed use community that was being developed on a big piece of land. And it was called the Woodlands. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the Woodlands. Look it up. Fascinating project. And Ian, as a landscape architect, was very familiar with natural systems and how to make natural systems work for you. The land developer, the people that own the land and were spending all the money to develop it, were hiring engineers. Engineers wanted to fill in the wetlands and pave over stuff. And Ian kept pushing back and pushing back and pushing back and saying, no, you're gonna create problems that you don't need to create. And finally, his last effort to convince them that he was right and the other way was wrong, was he did a cost study. And he cost out doing the design his way, which was to preserve the low-lying areas and allow them to become floodplains and absorb water. And to build on the higher ground, and to build streets that went around the topography and not just cut up and down or across the topography. And when he cost it all out, he had his final meeting with the developers and they're getting ready to fire him because he's been such a thorn in their side. And he said, if you do it your way, this is how much it's gonna cost to do all the land shaping and drainage. If you do it my way, it turned out, I don't even remember the numbers after 50 years, but let's just say if the engineering way was gonna end up costing them, let's say $50 million. Doing it his way was gonna cost 10. And he said, so you can save yourself $40 million and make a really nice community. And you'll get all the houses that you want, same number of units, but the whole system will perform better. Now, the follow-up to all of that was that subsequently in Hilton Head Island, there's a similar kind of community that was developed using the same design guidelines. In Chesterfield County, south of Richmond, still in the metro area, there's a community called Branderville, designed with the same guidelines. And it works like a champ. And so if I were going to throw back to what could we have done differently then, or differently along the way, it would have been to do what my book out of college said, which was design the landscape with the environmental systems, natural systems in mind. And of course, it doesn't work as well in a metropolitan area where it's densely developed. But there are other kinds of things that could be done to compensate, so.
Thank you for that perspective. Anyone on the panel want to add anything onto that? Or do you want to do questions? Yeah.
Thanks so much. So I actually don't think it's depressing, as Michelle said, that we're trying to get to the root of the problems, so I really appreciate the larger questions about thinking about both water quality, water quantity, and looking at land use and what we actually do. I mean, not just whether we do residential and stuff, but what else we do on the land. So sort of related to that, I would think that part of planning for resilience is asking those deeper questions rather than just addressing like whatever we're given. Like look at, the amount of stormwater, look at the quality of the stormwater, just like working the collaboration that you began to see and stuff. I would think all that would be part of the resilience that we need. So which comes to like the one slide I was confused about was Dave's slides about resilience. It was there all along. And the reason I'm confused about it is it sort of looked like, we needed to be resilient to things like extreme floods, right? Which we do. But then I would think that part of the reason we need to be resilient is we've messed up ecosystems, right? We messed up our weather system, we messed up our land use. So can you help me understand how resilience come to, it was there all along?
I'm not sure I can. I think that my point there was the quantity married to the quality was there all along. But what you're going a lot deeper with it, so I very much appreciate that. So, yeah, it just was always there, but now it's more pronounced. I think that was the only message. It's come back around after, we've been struggling with this TMDL for 25 years or whatever, so.
I appreciate your historical perspective and, seeing that historical perspective that we've always needed to manage nature, but not at the pace at which nature is changing because humans have changed nature. That's the scary part, right?
Yeah.
And unless we actually face how scary it is, we're not gonna get any.
Gotta face it. Yeah, anybody?
Just
Sounds good to me.
I'll talk loud.
Yeah.
Y'all mentioned testing, only testing within the permit, and Jason, you're phase one. And with a nod to Sadie, how much do you all still, three-part question.
only get one job.
Do you still have to monitor how much are you roughly spending a year, and are the results informing your permit strategy at all?
That's a great question. We've been talking about this a lot, and we kind of punted with the permit we currently have on this very point, because yes, we're continued to be required to monitor stormwater. And yes, the results are telling us that they're losing some stormwater. And it's not cheap, I think we're relatively small, and I think we've done a pretty good job, emphasizing other things we do so that we're getting credit for those things, but we still have to monitor. And I think over a permit cycle, it's well over $100,000. It might be a couple $100,000 permit cycle. And I'm sure some MSOs are spending $1 million a permit cycle. And this is a huge question, because I think a simplistic view is you're going to monitor to show if your programs are working. And I think anyone in this room, and like Sadie, and those are huge research questions, or Shirley, right? Like, you don't just throw some equipment in a stream or a pipe and just start taking samples and then saying, see where our programs are working, experimental design and baselines and all those things. So we're gearing up to negotiate our next permit, and this is top of mind. Like, can we do better with that money?
And I yield my time to say, talk about the pool monitoring.
Yeah.
Can't get Virginia interested in it for some reason.
I yield mine today, he knows that.
Okay, all right. Did I answer your three-part question?
Yeah.
Well, just in short, yeah, Sadie's done a masterful job putting that program together called Pool Monitoring and Restoration Research. So largely in Maryland, the MS4s can pay into this fund instead of doing their own monitoring, which I think, as Jason said, very limited utility to really derive any type of take-home points, or this works and that doesn't work, or let's tweak this. So Sadie's program has done monitoring on efficacy of stream restoration, green infrastructure, all kinds of VMPs, things that operate at site scales and watershed scales. So it's, we tried to get Virginia. Yeah, but that's not worth mentioning, just to say that is a pretty good model, open to all jurisdictions, I think, in the Bay watershed.
Yeah, I was gonna add to it. So they've also been funding toxicant research. So as the permits expand, or as the public gets very interested, I mean, we certainly know the public right now is very interested in where PFAS is. And so funding even things that right now are not on the permits is critically important. So it's everything you said, plus some other things that pool monitoring pool is really good at.
Yeah, and biota,
Mhm.
right. So it's not just the chemicals, but the living resources in the stream.
See, I'm gonna add, it's gonna become even more important as we see the federal funding being somewhat flaky in terms of not knowing what's gonna be available.
And that targeted research is what's gonna get changes in design standards or whatever relative to the implementation of these MS4 permits.
But I'm gonna agree with you very much because of the fact that what we hope we get out of it with the research that's being done, and the Bay's got this good thing for the pool monitoring and other sources, but right now, knowing, well, we've got a lot of the pool monitoring that people are contributing to, that when we change the design standards, we change them in a way that we're not causing more problems, but that we actually have some answers that we can work from to make design standards. As I was explaining back when the MS4s first came out, somebody asked me that question about what's going on. We only have 1 to 2 bites of this apple of water quality. I mean, I live in Pennsylvania, and I live in an area that's like, I don't give about the Bay, but they do care about their local stream. Many of them are anglers. But we're talking about putting practice in the ground. They don't see the stream still looks clean, or it still looks muddy because it rains across the ag field and sediment gets in there. So they don't see it. So we're trying to prove that this is working. And we're telling you it's gonna be $1 billion program, a $500 million program over 10 years. And if we come back and go too many more times and say, yeah, we didn't quite achieve what we planned on, and the streams are still impaired, at some point the public's gonna give up on us. So having the research to tweak the design standards to make sure what comes out, and then so what goes in the ground is actually going to achieve something. And everybody's trying to do this, everybody's trying to do it effectively. I'm not saying anybody's doing anything wrong, but if we get the design standards closer to achieving what we want to, we can narrow the variability of performance, and we've really gotten somewhere. And then, you know, we talk about the Bay, I travel a lot for ASCE, talk about the Bay work, and that becomes what people talk about. Then you get San Francisco Bay work and the other areas where they're seeing those investments in the state or local levels to try to replicate these kind of things. And now we've got the EPA Centers of Excellence, which it does, but got funded. Funding. So
I see it being sort of this mix of achieving something, adjusting expectations, and especially of the public, and also this is where the community engagement aspect comes into it. Because if you identify this is what they care about streams, how can we build the connection between what they care about and what is downstream?
So I was just gonna piggyback on that because again, with the pool monitoring program that got developed in Maryland that Sadie's really taken the lead on, you know, that was born out of a number of folks in Maryland, including with DNR and local governments, basically determining the money they were spending for MS4 monitoring was wholly being flushed down the toilet, essentially being used on an annual basis to collect data that was not useful at all, was not being used by the regulatory authorities. And like Jason says, you know, it's easily $100,000 or $200,000 a year per major jurisdiction. So I'm a little disappointed to hear Virginia is not interested in letting local governments participate.
No, it's not, I think they can.
Oh, they can.
It's just at the state level, they're not.
Oh, I got you. But I think that again, to Shirley's point, you really need this rigorous research that's done. It doesn't have to be done in every county across the state. It has to be done in a way that's representative, but that can be generalized elsewhere. And one of the things that came to light as we were working on the program for Maryland was that in the Pacific Northwest, they had developed independently of any conversations we were having, a very similar program a few years before. So it's a good idea whose design has popped up elsewhere in the country. And I think it's something that we have a lot to be proud of here locally, and it'd be great to have folks from Pennsylvania and Virginia participate as well.
would you like to?
Can you hear me? Okay. Question from another old guy. I think all of us in this room believe in stormwater management and know that stormwater management works. And we have also, in Virginia, we were lucky that when the requirements came for the NPDES permits, the SPO permits, we're lucky that we have been doing BMPs for a while. I mean, the first BMP manual came in the early 80s because of the Acacon watershed that was protected, and the work that Tom Grisser and others were doing there. So it wasn't a surprise for us. But we have had a lot of failures, and we have learned a lot through the years. And then we went into stream restoration, and the idea of taking a stream restoration as a BMP came up. And I think there's a lot of things happening. And now comes resilience. We have all dealt in public works with flooding problems, but now resilience comes. But stormwater really took off when there was that regulatory driver. There is no such thing for resilience, right? There is great examples of resilience projects, programs. Virginia is working right now in the flood protection master plan that Dave and I and others are helping. But there is no regulatory driver. So my question for you is, if you will have a clean slate, how will you change the permits to include quantity and quality, or should we include it? And you're going to say, well, that's never going to happen. So if there is no regulatory driver, the second part of the question for Robert Jones, the second part of the question is, if there is no regulatory driver, can you share some lessons learned on how you have used your leadership skills to convince elected officials and city, county managers to get these programs going? Because I think there is the need to start seeing things come together and move away from just having regulations to drive.
Can I take that question first and before we go to permits?
Yeah.
Because I'm not in the permit space. Okay, so I'm gonna do a shameless plug. End of June, ASCE convened a workshop and the videos are online. ASCE has a memorandum of understanding with NOAA around climate and climate resilient data. And through their industry proving ground, talking to engineers about what data do we need and how we bring it into, how do they provide a way that we can use it? Okay. Given some of the changes and given the maturity of that relationship this year, we actually convened our 2-day workshop around making the business case for resiliency. And that is where the driver is going to come. It may come into the permits eventually, but the business case is what is going to drive it. Sitting on a panel was the Reinsurance Association. So ASCE was sitting at a meeting with Deputy Secretary of Commerce in Asheville, pre-Hilling, with the Retail Association and the Reinsurance Association. And let me tell you, those people care. They care a lot. For every dollar we put into resiliency, they are estimating somewhere between $5 and $20 worth of savings. And so if we're going to deal with resiliency quickly, it's going to be financial. And in all seriousness, in those meetings, we had people coming up afterwards from the insurance industry and from the investment industry going, so what do you guys need to move standards forward? You know, that is a question that is coming up very quickly. And it may be a financial driver. Is the insurers not covering people in Texas or in parts of Texas or in Florida? Just they're pulling out. They can't afford it. And so, or they won't afford it. And so it may be that part first. And then I think that will be coming examples. The next question is, what if we write standards? How do we get localities to adopt it? And the business case said, we won't give investment properties in those towns money to do the investment unless this goes into their regulatory requirements.
Yeah. And the ASCE has a flood standard now.
We have a flood standard. We have 24s come out again. 7's going to pick up some more additional, and when it comes out 28. Unfortunately, neither of those right now have Atlas 15 in it, because Atlas 15 was a couple of months behind schedule. But if anybody has seen this, we're recording, aren't we? Okay, can't say it that way. Thankfully, we convinced a big public outcry, convinced the federal government that we actually should do volume 2. Because for a long time, they weren't going to do volume 2 and weren't going to guarantee we're going to get volume 1. But there was a big public outcry from people like the air protection engineering societies, the reinsurance, that this had to come in. And we don't care if you just call it long-term weather changes. You don't want to use climate change, fine. But if you will call it long-term weather change, weather by 2100, we don't care. Just get us volume 2. And to just give you, I'm going to say one thing and I'll pass it over to people who actually do permits. ASCE in general, particularly around the building standards, has made a decision that they're going to design to a 3°C change. That's what's going into the new building standards, the loads, and also going into the flood standards. It's just an assumption we're going to see a 3°C change. So rather than saying we're going to follow whatever representative concentration pathway or scenario pathway, they're like, we don't know when it's going to happen. We could get to it in 2035. We might get to it in 2090. We don't care. But we think in the time frame of the 100 years that this infrastructure is in the ground, and Pennsylvania is still digging out wood pipes in addition to lead pipes. We know it's underground and it seems to be functioning okay. We are not going to go dig up the street to go get to it. We have to assume this is going to be here for 100 years. So they're assuming in that 100-year time frame, we will cross the 3°C threshold. And that's changing building materials. That's changing asphalt mixes. That is changing thoughts around the rainfall patterns and what sizes our pipes and the culverts and everything else are. That's where we're going. Sorry, my soapbox.
It's a lot. It's really useful information as an engineer to have that science and have that research saved somewhere. Because that's definitely the thing that you can't access some of that information. But I think I can't answer the question on how to change legislators' minds, but I will also shamelessly plug the center has a National Watershed Research Network, And our next, or project that we're working on now is doing case studies on how municipalities, local municipalities have incorporated climate change and resiliency into their, whatever regulations or legislation or whatever it may be. And so that's coming out hopefully end of the year, so stay tuned for that. And the whole point of it is to get at like, what did you say to them to get them, to convince them to add this, right? And I'm gonna say, like, just having gone through some of it, a lot of it is that a major event happened, like Texas, like Nashville, and something happened. And what it is the public wants it. And that's really what will get people to drive the change, is that the people that are voting, the people that were voting those legislators in, they're the ones that are like, what happened? Why was this able to happen? Like, and that is really where you can get like the mayor or the governor or somebody to push and go to the DEPs and DEQs and MDEs or whatever to be like, explain to me what happened and how we're gonna fix it. And so, and I never want to wait for that to happen, right? But that's just kind of how the reality of the situation is that a lot of people environmental issues don't become a problem until it's a problem.
We have a great example there in Ellicott City.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Hey, Carol, is that an index of state or is it state, local, whatever you got?
Yeah, so our first project is already online, and I can, if you guys want more information, I can send it to you. We reviewed every state's stormwater standard and how it addresses climate resiliency based on that state, because obviously, like, flooding or, different states have different reactions to climate change, right? More intense heat, more intense rain, no rain, droughts. So it depends on sea level rise. That doesn't really matter to Utah, right? And so we kind of addressed and looked at each state and how their standards do or don't meet those criteria. And then now this case study is local jurisdictions, just because we see that it's a little bit easier to move in a smaller scale about climate change. And so a lot of really strong local municipalities have made these changes. PWD is one of them in Philly, right? They have an internal PWD standard for climate resiliency about how internally, when they build facilities, like when they upgrade their wastewater treatment plants, because they're all really close to the water. They're incorporating sea level rise, they're incorporating more extreme precipitation, and kind of getting at how did all that happen in more of a local sense, just because that just seems to be the trend of bigger changes and being able to incorporate it. So that's what the project will be.
Fernanda, was your question about regulatory? How do you convince?
Both of, yeah.
Yeah, regulatory. Well, I just have to say, regulations are a lagging action to other things that happen in society. I mean, you can look up a picture of Richard Nixon standing on the beach in Santa Barbara after the oil spill in the early 1970s. So it wasn't that the Clean Water Act was out ahead of things happening in our country. It was a response, and it's going to be the same now. And what Shirley said, a lot of the response will be to economic well-being. And one of the things that Shirley mentioned was the insurance industry. But we were at a Resilient Virginia conference at JMU a few weeks ago, and they were also talking about the borrowing capacity of local governments to implement their capital improvement programs. That's 75% of capital investments nationwide are through local government borrowing. And if that borrowing is based on AAA bond rating, that they can borrow money fairly cheaply. Well, if they lose that because the integrity of the local government system and their infrastructure is failing, they lose the AAA bond rating. Every capital improvement project becomes more expensive. At the same time that redoing the infrastructure or improving the infrastructure for resilience is becoming acute. So those are the kind of things, it might be citizens, but there's these other pressures that are really squeezing us to action. Yeah. And we go along kicking and dragging, but eventually it'll happen.
How are you, Fernando? Excited to see you. You were backlit, so I didn't, until you started speaking, I didn't know that was you.
Mystery man.
Yeah, the mystery man.
I have a different picture today.
I talked a little bit about this, and we were talking about this earlier this morning too, this question about like, how far should permits go and what should be in them? It's almost becomes almost a little bit of a, sort of a role of government conversation, and to what extent can a permit drive like local values, what decision making, about life safety decisions and other things. And right now I kind of tend to lean towards like, let's not put this stuff in permits per se, but then how do you get local governments to act, particularly if funding, which it's going to be, is a constraint. And I don't have an answer to that. I can talk about our own generally. I can talk about our experience as one of those, what we talked about, we had a major flood. I mean, really 2 years worth of flooding in 2018 and 2019. And that's what spurs the local government to act. I mean, their homes are destroyed and, narrowly escaping, frankly, death because the storm happened to occur at 9 in the morning as opposed to 9 or 11 at night, and people happen to be awake at least. And so we went from, $30 million or so 10-year CIP to a $300 million 10-year CIP. And stormwater utility, and my colleague Steve Skoron sitting in the back, he's our stormwater utility manager. And, a lot of things had to come together. I mean, I think our county manager, saw the opportunity to use this new financing tool, or new for us, and that actually takes pressure off of some of the general fund things, but now we're kind of in that capital borrowing space, right? And things are getting tighter now, so it's not like getting the money solves the problem, it's the first step, and now implementing it is a bigger challenge. And I mentioned like the voluntary property acquisition being a real area of focus, because no matter what we do, there's going to be flooding. You can make the pipe bigger, it's still going to flood, but something's going to exceed its capacity. So we've kind of, we focused on, and it wasn't inexpensive, but we made the investment in some pretty decent analysis, basically modeling where flooding is going to occur and what it's going to impact, and framing it as what are the costs of inaction. You have this flooding, what's getting damaged, what are the costs, and what would it cost if we didn't make these investments. So I think that's just a piece of the puzzle to, and it's been mentioned here today a few times, like what would happen, what are you going to spend if you don't do it? Like Scott mentioned it a little while ago, what's going to cost you if you don't make these investments now? And it starts to make a case, but if, we're a relatively wealthy locality, I think there's lots of places that don't have that ability to raise that kind of capital. And so it's much more challenging there. Where are they going to get financing from to make these investments?
I have a related question, sort of maybe almost the reverse of what Fernando asked, because as I've been hearing you talk, especially Jason, I think maybe your fifth tenet was kind of maybe keep this out of the permits, which you just kind of said as well, but then we're talking about how everything's moving towards resilience, right? I mean, Dave had his errors where we had progress, and, what do you think is moving towards resilience really progress? Obviously something we have to do because flooding is a serious issue and becoming more so. But is something being lost with water quality as we make that move?
Yeah, it's some of you probably read this. It's Andy Reese, who's been in this field for a long time, wrote that it's similar to Dave's eras, but called it Back to the Future. We're going back to originally before there was quality, there was quantity, right? All basic, dry ponds and those sorts of things, and then quality. So it's a really interesting question. Are we going back or not? And I didn't take the mic to answer that, but I think just to reinforce that's a really interesting question. And then what are the water quality impacts of major flooding events that cause serious, damage to natural systems and erosion? That's something to think about too, but maybe they're only once every 5 years in certain areas versus the annual build up and wash off of them. So I think that's a really question. I'm gonna pass it down because I think there'll be other insights shared. Right, Dave? You got it?
Y'all, these are hard questions. What do you think we are, philosophers in here? I don't think so. I don't think we would sacrifice water quality. For one reason, as Jason said, because the big events, we've been designing for 1-inch storms, 1.2, whatever. But these big things are coming through and ripping our stream channels apart, mass wasting. So probably if we compared the loads of one infrequent event versus dozens of small events, we would learn, and Shirley might have insights on this, so the microphone's going this way. But, the whole thing right now about resilience is nature-based solutions, which I think is great. I mean, it's really about floodplains and using nature, but we really got to do gray too, to solve the problem. And, that they'll work together, but I don't think we should lose the focus on water quality, but reframe it.
I feel like with climate change, climate resiliency, changing weather patterns, whatever you want to call it, we can't think about it as one or the other, or we're sharing the same pot of money. I think we have to add more money to this pot and address both things. Because we keep fighting, going one to the other and one to the other, and the reality is that it's becoming a bigger problem than, that whatever pot we have now. And we just need to be realistic that we can't just keep stealing from stormwater, right? Or the other way around, and that we just need more money and more funding and more resources to address these problems, because it's just gonna keep happening. That everything's just gonna flood and everyone's gonna complain and, blame the government as to why, things aren't happening. But it's like, well, you have to pay a little bit more in taxes or fees or something. Somebody does, right? Like, we can't solve these problems with the limited resources that we have. We're doing our best. And so I think that's what I think is that we have to do both.
Okay, so I can philosophize. No, I won't. Although I think they told me I could have tenure on in humanities at my school. So, anyway, yes, it does sometimes, I think, for people see, because of this emphasis around flooding, it seems like we are dropping the water quality ball, and so it does appear that way. I do think that people are smart enough, and we've got enough ingrained people who do both hydrology and water quality, that we can keep it in mind. We also have enough data now that we can begin to understand how the practices we're using to address flooding will get us to the water quality. We still need to be having that and talking about that message. I think we're going to come in, this is going to be the challenge. And again, we begin to have let me take it to a very practical standpoint. I had an undergrad student who's going to finish up her paper this year. Honor student who for honors project took the BMP database, and we started looking at it across rainfall depths. Just trying to get peak intensity is just very difficult for that. We looked at rainfall depths where that was going into those storms. And you can see the degradation in performance, and max envelope starts getting smaller as the storm sizes get larger. But there are also very few data points, because the people who are contributing to the database, with the exception of some of the researchers, are only monitoring storms that count for their permit. And so they don't monitor the larger storms. So we're also looking at, there are some data points, but there are not a lot of them. So again, thinking also about how do we expand that data set? How can we sit down and say, okay, great, you built this fire retention system. And now instead of it being the 1 inch of runoff or the runoff from a 1 inch storm or 1.2 inch storm or whatever it is, or in Pennsylvania, it's about a 2.3 inch because we do a 2-year pre-post. It is a substantially different. The substantial amount of water we've got to capture in Pennsylvania is huge in a lot of places. But the idea is that we have some idea of how some of these things work. But if we know what the max envelope performance is, we can say, okay, yeah, you're not going to get, if you're going to go to the permit that likes percent removals and the mains like percent removals, you're not going to get 80% in a big storm, but you're going to get 50. At least we know that. And then we think about how does this all partner together. But it is going to require thinking about how do we generate data across a wider range of storms. And not just the permit storms. And again, I understand fully why the municipalities monitor for permit storms, so that's what's in the permit. And that's what their regulatory requirements are. They don't have money to do a lot else. But how can we encourage that piece of it to think about coming across a wide range of it? Then you don't have to sacrifice water quality, because you can tell both sides. But we did the message to the public. But I can tell you, when we were doing a project years ago, back, oh gosh, probably 10, 12 years ago. And I remember going out with a person who was interviewing, we're talking to DEP, to Lee's boss years ago. And we also talked to a couple of the local township managers who were dealing with stormwater. And one of them said it bluntly, He goes, nobody calls me up to tell me about water quality. They call me up if the street's flooded. And so that's a reality. You know, the anglers care, Trout Unlimited cares, a lot of the others care, but again, a lot of people who are in public works are investing because they have to. Others are seeing some great results and you can use those as examples. But my little 10,000, I can promise you, my borough is, when college is not in session, we're about 9,200 people. We have buried streams that are flooding on a regular basis in people's basements. That's the local detention pond. In people's basements. Seriously, I got pictures. Tropical Storm Lee, one of my neighbors, and when I bought my house, I deliberately didn't buy in that area. But she's 3 blocks away from me, 3 blocks away. In Tropical Storm Lee, her basement filled up about a third of the way. The Tropical Storm Lee almost lined up perfectly on top of our watershed, just angle-wise. We got about 13 inches of rain over 3 days, and in the northern part of the watershed, they got about 15. She only filled up a third of the basement. That was 2011. 2017, we got 4.71 inches in 85 minutes. Her basement filled to the top of the rafters. You can see the pictures on NPR. That's what's happening. And these intense storms that are overwhelming our systems are what are causing the problems. And you can see her little soap bottles and oil bottles and all that floating to the top from her basement. We have to tell the water quality story because we are ripping things out. But there are mid-sized storms that are overwhelming the system. We're not getting as good a treatment, and they are washing off things off the land. They're washing off, you know, they're scouring out our pipes with whatever's captured in there. They're scouring out sediments in the streams. We've got to still have to tell the water quality story. But Tropical Storm Lee was also nice that there was a chemical plant that has rail cars with sulfuric acid and chlorine behind the apartment I was living in at the time. And their little day tanks were floating down the creek, and they caught several of them at the Conowingo Dam, about 50 miles downstream. You know, so, but only the ones were a quarter full or less. So we do have to tell that, but we're going to see more of this. So again, we've got to figure out, our communications people got to figure out how to marry the two together. But people are concerned about bailing out their basement, and does their house still have mold? And can they afford, they're not in a floodplain, they probably don't have flood insurance. And all they're doing is they got a couple $1,000s from their insurance company to repair. That's what my neighbor got, about $3,000. 7 years later, she still has not been able to replace the front porch. She's like, just don't step in these parts, it's a little creaky. But they're a working class. 2 people in the house work. They don't have the money to constantly go out and replace things. It was a fortune for them to move the electrical box out of the basement to the first floor. But it filled up the street to her front door. I mean, so I don't know that I answered your question. We can't lose the water quality story.
I don't know that there is an answer to the question.
I don't think we have. I think what we've learned we can apply to larger storms and to larger storm treatments. We just have to be better at telling the story, and engineers are bad at that. We were not trained, and researchers are not trained to tell you anything without 5,000 words of jargon. Oh, by the way, I can dig that up too. Sorry about the long answer.
No, they're powerful stories, and you're right, we do need to find these avenues to actually tell them and move beyond our silos that were.
And then when they did the story on my case, that's what they focused on, was a neighbor. My part of the NPR story was about yay big, and they focused on the interview with her, and I was glad because it brought the issue home.
Do you need the mic?
I don't know if everybody can hear me.
Yeah.
So I'm Don Dorsey with Frederick County, Maryland government. So, you know, talking about what might go into the permit and all that, I mean, just kind of exactly what you were saying. You know, when you think about a regulatory permit, it has consent decree, it has fines associated. And when we have seen a lot of this climate related storms kind of sit, unfortunately, in our Carroll County neighbors, we had a kid just lost their life just this past Friday because of that intense storm. Our infrastructure is not there. We know that. And so I think there's a marrying between the two priorities. And it may not, I like what Jason said, it may not necessarily be something you want to put in the permit, but it's already a priority at a local level. Our emergency management for Frederick County, we have our our hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan, which has identified road closures, identified first floor elevations, has identified a whole bunch of slew of things that are concerning. And so they put them in, we put all these projects into that list, which then can go after federal funding now that it's in this hazard mitigation plan. So when we look at our MS4 permit and our projects that we're doing for the MS4 for water quality, we can find some marrying things where we can do both at the same time, and we can accomplish both of these things. However, I do really strongly, we love to help people, but when you start putting consent decrees within that language, how are you going to do an Ellicott City, and what would that consent decree look like if they didn't meet that permit? Because they wouldn't be able to. You couldn't be able to mastermind a 1,000-year storm event and be okay with consent decree for all of that. So that would be, that's where I think balance is, trying to figure out what that might look like. Both priorities are definitely 100% in everybody's forefront, and I think every government, you know, and no NGOs are all about it too. So just.
But why did you need the hazard mitigation plan? Because you needed to have the plan to get FEMA loans.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So if, I mean, that's not a regulatory requirement, but it's an incentive to the fund.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what I think we as a sector need to put together is what do we need to do, whether it's the standards or any other things, so we can move this forward, because no one's going to tell us, just like nobody told us how to write a manual way back then, or the Chesapeake Bay program that you need a manual too. You have to be ahead. There's no question to that.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more from the audience.
I was actually just going to comment on that question. I don't think that MS4 permits could have or would have a quantity component to it, because they tie back to the Clean Water Act, and there's already been some court rulings that flow in itself. Water is not a pollutant. It, you know, the permit can regulate the quantity of pollutants in stormwater, not the quantity of stormwater itself. So I think there are other mechanisms we need to look at, like updating the National Flood Insurance Program and the CRS maybe requirements, but I don't think, you know, and like you said, there's just a compliance limit that would put municipalities in a really rough spot if quantity of stormwater was included in the permit. So hopefully, you know, there's an answer out there that maybe will help find.
Yeah, I don't think that was my question. Mine was, where are we going with the money? That I think that might have been your question more, but yeah, I think I don't think anyone's saying it should be in an MS4 permit.
But I do think the question comes up is that, given climate, should the amount of water we're planning to treat change? How much does that make a difference if we're getting larger or more intense storms? Do we need to think about how the practices increase slightly, change slightly, and that water quality storm is different, given the changing rainfall intensity and rainfall totals of what's hitting the stream, versus what's being bypassed in a device for treatment?
Or do we look at how we define our standard for stormwater management? DC has a retention standard, which I've always been a fan of personally. The way getting above the from time. Not all the other states do that. Fellow, did you want to?
Yeah, more like an observation. My name is Bernard Mahmoud. I'm with Morgan State University. I would say this, I'm more of a construction person, so in the stormwater management field, I'm more of an intruder. But in the last, I'll use that word. But in the last few years, I've studied a lot about stormwater management. That's what I did. And I would say this, looking forward, 50 years down the line, there are a lot of systems that have been put in place in the last couple of years, from what I understood. We just had this conversation with Dr. James Hunter on Friday about what is the future of the systems. We have a lot of the permits, the requirement is mostly on getting the systems in the ground, installing the systems, but there's limited conversation or limited focus on the maintenance of those systems over a long period of time. In my research, I studied what Prince George's County are doing, and over the last 10 years, they have installed about 300 to 400 systems. They have a 30-year commitment for maintenance, but you don't really hear about the maintenance of the systems in the long term. And Dr. Hunter asked this question, what would you regard the life cycle of a system, right? We have systems that have been in place for about 30, 40, 20, 30 years now. Probably some of those systems are not functioning as they should be. So what is that? Looking at the resilience of the systems and what Dr. Clark just mentioned, we have the issue of climate change, change in precipitation. The systems are receiving more water as they were designed for X, they're performing as Y. So down the line, I will say the resilience, we need to define first, what is the life cycle of a system? Do we need to change the maintenance practices that are currently being done on those systems? And also the sustainability of the system in itself, not just the environmental aspects of the practices, water quality, quantity, there's a social or economic dynamic that comes into play, not just in delivery, but also in the long-term operation of the systems. Dr. Masha Adib, I know in Penn State, she studies the interaction between community and the systems, the behavior of the people that are around the systems. So I think those are also other issues that need to come into the forefront to understand how, looking ahead 50 years, how we can ensure the systems are doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, actually, I do. I caught you with the red mic. I agree with you. What to say though, I think that we see it some, particularly in Pennsylvania, where places will oftentimes even opt for gray infrastructure because the life cycle is going to be longer. That we do have 30-year data on green infrastructure, but if we go out and tell a municipality that green infrastructure is going to only last 30 years, nature-based solutions are going to last 30 years, there's going to be some thought about, I can invest in an underground detention storage and I've solved my problem for the next 100. And by the way, I'll be retired and I'm good, I'm gone. It's the same flip side. I tell my students now, they are designing infrastructure that's going to be in the ground in 2100. Those are designs that are being done now. And they are not designed for climate. They're designed by current standards. So again, it's going to be this balancing act of how can we continue to get long-term performance data? And if it's not resilient or it's not performing as well, what does that mean for replacement or maintenance? I mean, if it's a very cheap upgrade and improvement, wonderful. But if you start telling you're going to dig it out or replace it or it's going to clog or you're going to fill it in, then we've got some challenges with the public because they're going to be thinking about that long-term investment.
Yeah.
Maybe you look like.
Well, we don't have enough time to.
Well, I'm getting.
No, it's awesome. Really, it's a workforce issue and it's a kind of infrastructure ownership, the role that stormwater has in the, water, sewer, stormwater. It's sort of the poor country cousin, HOAs trying to maintain these things. So it's a really big issue, but the workforce and the knowledge and the commitment to realize this is infrastructure. I always use the example, say every property along a street was responsible for maintaining their section of the sanitary sewer. That would be ridiculous, right? We would never put up with that. But yet, if they have in their neighborhood a detention pond, each individual one is responsible. And we know it's not going to work. We just keep doing it because we can't envision the next step in terms of ownership of the infrastructure and the workforce that would do it, and the technical part of understanding the life cycle, as you mentioned. So I say during these eras, we are also in the recognition of maintenance era. And there are, MS4s have come, some of them that have bought into it are so many years ahead, light years ahead of where they were 30 or 40 years ago. So it's not just doom and gloom, but let's continue on to understand it.
That tees me up really well for
The optimistic part.
final question. Before we break a little bit early, we'll do some housekeeping before I let you all go enjoy your afternoon. But taking the long view, then building on that, what do you see as the greatest progress made in the world of stormwater, and where is the most potential for maintaining momentum going into the future?
You do, she's closest to you.
Then I get to do, okay. I've been coming to this retreat for a long time. Do you guys, who watched the Muppets? Anyone here know the Muppets? You know, the two old guys in the balcony? That's me and Dave, I think, right now. So, but I'm gonna say the fun part, like, I think it's this room and, you know, there's people here who've been here and come to this retreat, like with me and Dave and others over the years, but there's a lot of new faces in here and a lot of energy and a lot of new ideas. So I think there's a lot of optimism in that this is one of those wicked problems. I think most of the things we talked about today fall in that wicked problem space, and the fact that people keep coming to try to chip away at that, like, to me, that's the biggest upside. I know it's not quite the substantive answer, but you guys will do that, but that to me is a big one. It's really, for me, it makes me really optimistic and encouraged about where we're headed.
You call me a Muppet. Yeah, when I get older, losing my hair, which is happening today. Same thing. How many people in this room, raising your hand, are you under 40? Okay, that's it. How many of you, and for those of you under 40, we apologize for the situation we left you. And we're glad you're here. We're glad you're here, and we're so trusting in you and inspired by you just joining this field. When we joined, it wasn't a field, it wasn't a career, and now it is, and it's just awesome you're here. How many people are over 65? Well, thank you too. Thank you for your service. And we did try, we were in it. I mean, just as Scott said, Fernando, so many different experiences we had with the water quality and the whole thing with the TMDL. So it's not wasted. It's just incredibly important. And what's important about it is the stories. It may not be the research paper, or it may not be the book that Scott wrote in 1975, but the stories that we can tell of why it's been important to us, about our neighbors, about the things that happen in our community, our experiences with our kids. You know, those are going to be the stories and the things that bring us together as communities, because the other thing that we have to do is look at the disproportionality of the impacts of these storms on different communities, different segments. And so we have a lot of community building to do, and I fully trust that bridges will be built, and, you know, we're going to figure some pretty wicked problems out moving forward. And if you're between 40 and 65, thanks to you as well.
Steve alluded to this, but he did not say it out loud. It is his birthday today, so. Well, today's my birthday, maybe when we go get drinks or something.
Yeah. Drink tickets.
Yeah, drink tickets. Well, maybe give them a few extra or not. I don't know about that.
Maybe we'll give the singers extra vacations.
Well, the singers, right?
I think that while right now it is a really rough time in terms of federal funding, I think that on the positive spin of that, it makes us work harder and makes us pull together and educate and kind of like need to do things to figure out how to fund these projects. And, you know, as Shirley mentioned this, the EPA did fund, and we have gotten FY26 funding for the the Stormwater Centers of Excellence, which CWP is a part of. And so that's really exciting that, and it's a congressional ask, and it's a whole, I don't really understand all that too much, but the fact that it got funded means that somebody, some legislator, some senator cares about stormwater and wants to fund this and wants to fund regional centers of excellence to help improve stormwater. And one of the things is that, like, while, you know, we're not meeting our 2025 goals, the Chesapeake Bay is we forget this because we're in it. We are so progressive when it comes to stormwater. And what Dave said, like, thank you all for all of the work that we do and you guys do, because we are the leaders in terms of the country in stormwater. You can't say we can leverage all this information into the California where it like rains once a year, right? But, for like what we're doing, we have a lot of funding and we do a lot of work. It's just not enough. There's a lot more work left to do. And I'm diverging off of what the question was, because I already forgot. But I just want us to recognize that we are doing a lot. And, I think one of the big things that the Center of Excellence, for me, I want to do is take the information, all the stuff that you guys have learned, and bring it to the states that are only just starting to have the stormwater conversation, because we have so many lessons learned and we've done such good work, and maybe some less good work, that we don't want them to repeat those errors either. So I thank you all for everyone's hard work.
So Carol, what was the question?
I don't remember.
The future. The optimistic commission.
The future momentum going. Where do I see the momentum going? I retired a few years. Seriously, I'm gonna have to agree with everybody on the panel. It's anytime I walk into a classroom, anytime I look out in this audience and I see all of you that are the next steps. When I joined, like Dave, like Scott, there were a few of us here and there. I worked for Bob Pitt. He was my PhD advisor. He was one of the few looking at water quality back in the 70s. And I look at what you all are doing. I said earlier, the growth of the field to bring in multiple professions. The recognition this is not a pipe problem. This is an environment problem. This is an ecosystem problem. And I think that what Carol said is critically important. We have a lot of stuff out there that we have learned from. We've made mistakes. We've learned from the mistakes. But your enthusiasm, your interest, and again, I think that's where we're getting to. We're seeing, even in places that have been a little bit more resistant, we're starting to see those changes. And not just from the regulatory stick, but because the citizens care. They're seeing things happen and the citizens care. And I think that's where that is. We just have to continue to be good storytellers, to continue to be good neighbors, and continue to help people understand why this is important. And again, keep going. We just keep moving forward.
And thanks to Michelle for putting this together.
Yes.
Thank you all. So we don't have everyone in this room right now who will be at the retreat this weekend, but raise your hand if this is your first time to a CSN stormwater retreat. Okay, everyone look around the room. And raise your hand if you have been to a stormwater retreat before. Nice, look around again. Okay, see if you kind of remember who those folks were. Introduce yourselves to neighbors during these sessions when you take a seat. If you sit next to someone you know, don't know, make sure you introduce them. If you know the person, I hope you say hi to. So a couple housekeeping things. I'll start real quick. You will start to see a couple of these posted around in the session rooms, these QR codes throughout the weekend. Please take a look at the nice short Google form that's attached, because we really want to hear what your stormwater wins have been, as well as if you have seen others who have projects or programs that you really think deserve recognition and might not have that publicity, share them with us. And there's an opportunity to enter an email or not. And if it's something that we can reach out to folks about for future trainings, webinars, to highlight them at a retreat, we want to do some crowdsourcing for that. So pay attention to those posters. If you're just arriving, dinner is going to be 5:30 to 7:30, I'm pretty sure. And it's the building that's across the bridge. It's the one on signs, the Headwaters Lodge. So just so you know where that location is. And can Missy and Paola raise their hands? They are going to have our drink tickets. Missy is our education and outreach coordinator, and Paola is the CSN intern. So you will get to meet them when you, or if you choose to grab a drink ticket from them, either tonight or tomorrow. Some will be available tonight. We'll have some tomorrow. After dinner, at the Headwaters Lodge, you'll see umbrellas and fire pits, and there will be folks, and we encourage you all to join and hang out for a little bit and have a drink or hang out by the fire. There's a game with a hoop and you like do this and try to get it on a hook and it's actually really fun. I was really close. And there's trails, and lots of places to hang out and enjoy this beautiful rest of your evening before dinner. David, anything else you want to add?
No, thank you all for coming. So glad that all of you are here. You don't know me, I'm David, I'm the director at CSN. Really appreciate all your time. Huge shout out to Michelle for all of her planning that she did on the retreat this year. We look forward to continuing like all of the conversations. I think the panel did like an outstanding job, but I think all of the things they touched on are going to be themes in all of our sessions throughout the rest of the next 2 days. So all of the sessions are going to be designed to be this discussion oriented and interactive. So be ready to share your thoughts and opinions. It's very much like a collective. There will be people at the front of the room, but everybody is kind of a presenter in this event. So huge thank you. Yeah, we'll see you at dinner between 5:30 and 7:30.